And I base this on conversations with people in the Trump administration, including some people who recently left, who have said in very clear words that the Iranians just needed to talk to him directly, and it frankly did not even seem to matter which Iranian it was. The only thing Iran can offer that no other country can offer is actually the opportunity for reconciliation between the US and Iran. Something historic, something that really plays to Trump's ego, that he can say, I'm the president that ended 45 years of US-Iran enmity. There are Israelis who also believe, who I've spoken to, who believe that even without a green light or approval of the United States, involvement of the United States, Netanyahu may nevertheless start the war on his own, Israel alone, even though this will be a militarily very dangerous move to do. But he will do so with the calculation that once the war has started, he will be in a better position to pressure Trump to come in and support Israel, particularly if there is a high casualty event on the Israeli side, meaning that Iran retaliates very ferociously, a lot of Israelis get killed, and then Trump will use that as a second October 7th in order to really pressure the United States to support it. Waiting Trump out for 3 years, thinking that nothing will happen in the next 3 years. I mean, we see right now, just yesterday, Netanyahu was here again, pushing for another war, and once again managing to get Trump to slowly but surely come to his side and take his position, at least based on
سلام آقای پارسی، خیلی ممنون از اینکه دعوت ما رو پذیرفتید.
خواهش میکنم، خیلی خوشحالم که با شما باشم.
سلامت باشید. من سوال اولم رو با در واقع دیدار ترامپ و نتانیاهو شروع میکنم، چون ترامپ توی دیدار با نتانیاهو 2 تا خط قرمز ترسیم کرد، یکیش هسته‌ای و یکیش هم موشکی، که فکر می‌کنم برای اولین بار بود که به صراحت در مورد موشکی خط قرمز ترسیم کرد. تحلیل شما از این سخنان ترامپ چه بود و این صحبت که بعضی از در واقع معتقدند ترامپ چراغ سبز رو برای حمله به ایران به اسرائیل داد، به نظر شما درسته یا نه؟
And thank you so much for being with you, and my apologies for responding in English. I think we have to be a bit careful because we still don't have clear information about what the conversation was between Trump and Netanyahu. Instead, what we have is this incoherent press conference in which he was saying contradictory things that can be interpreted in many, many different ways. And I haven't managed to get a readout yet exactly what happened in the internal meetings. But if we go simply by what was said at that press conference, clearly there was a very adamant effort by both sides to present themselves as being exactly on the same page. Trump clearly had adopted some of the Israeli talking points for the first time, nodding to the missiles. I don't think he actually used the words missiles. Instead, he just responded to the question. And it's not entirely clear to me as to whether he fully understood the question, because the answer doesn't give you much context or depth. And I think we should keep in mind that this is taking place in the midst of a very advanced stage of negotiations between the US, Russia, and Ukraine. And given Trump's lack of bandwidth and lack of focus, it's not entirely clear to me whether he actually knew what the conversation was about when he was saying yes to various things. And this has always been a bit of a concern, that precisely because he has this lack of attention and lack of bandwidth, that he will actually cave to Netanyahu when he is overwhelmed by other issues. So Netanyahu essentially chose to, or requested to come at this moment, and probably knew quite well that this would be a very busy time for Trump, and as a result may at least interpret that he got a lot of things that he wanted out of Trump because Trump just didn't resist as he otherwise perhaps could have or would have. But again, we don't know. We're reading quite a lot into what was just a 20-minute press conference.
به نظر شما هدف نتانیاهو از سفر و دیدار با ترامپ و نقطه محوری این سفر ایران بود و اگر ایران بود آیا نتانیاهو به خواسته خودش رسید یا نه؟
So I think Netanyahu had the most important objective he had with this trip was to get the United States, not just to give a green light for Israel to attack Iran, but to get the United States on board actively in the attack. And let me take a step back and try to explain why I think from Netanyahu's standpoint, the belief in the necessity of another war is so strong. The Israelis had three key objectives with the war they launched in June of this year. They wanted to decapitate the Iranian government, the regime, the entire system. They wanted to get the US into the war, and they wanted to take a first decisive step towards turning Iran into the next Lebanon or Syria. Countries that Israel can attack at will with impunity without American involvement. This is what they are doing in Lebanon. This is what they're doing in Syria on a daily basis. They're bombing. There's no consequence for them. And the US is actually not involved. This, from the Israeli standpoint, obviously would not take one attack, but it would be, the first attack would be very important, of course. Of these, they only achieved the first one, which was to get the US into the war. This is the first time after more than 25 years that they have really tried hard to get the US to attack Iran, that they succeeded. They did not manage to decapitate the regime, nor did they manage to establish a significant step forward in this effort to subjugate Iran under Israeli hegemony. And the reason for that, of course, is the effectiveness of Iran's missiles. Even though the Israelis denied the impact and the military censorship in Israel, denied any reporting or prevented any reporting of the impact, it's quite clear that the impact and the damage this inflicted on Israel was very, very severe. So that then created a new situation, a situation that is intolerable for Netanyahu and his legacy. Because right now, as a result of the effectiveness of the missiles, you have effectively mutual deterrence between Israel and Iran. Both sides can deter each other. Both sides can inflict damage on each other. Compare this to what you had in Gaza and Lebanon. In Gaza, it took 2 years to drag the Israelis into a ceasefire. And even then, they immediately violated it. In Lebanon, about a year. And even then, immediately, they violated it. In the case of Iran, it took 9 days for the Israelis to ask for a ceasefire. And since then, they have not violated it. And again, it's because of this mutual deterrence. Now, under normal circumstances, one would think that, okay, because there is this mutual deterrence, this actually will enable not peace, but an absence of war. But for the Israelis, mutual deterrence is the worst of outcomes. For Netanyahu's legacy, this is the worst of outcomes. He wanted to achieve hegemony. Instead, so far, he's achieved mutual deterrence. This is unacceptable. And mindful of the fact that there will be elections in Israel in about 9.5 months, and that Netanyahu's political future very well may be at risk. I think Netanyahu's calculation is that he cannot leave office and leave as his legacy that he started a war with Iran, and instead of achieving hegemony, he achieved mutual deterrence. And as a result, I think it is very clear that the Israelis will attack again. The question has always been what the timing of it would be and whether the Israelis would manage to get the United States in on that attack. And this is why yesterday's meeting was so crucial. He came to Washington 6 months after the previous war. He shifted his focus. It appears that he had a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, he seems to have been sharing intelligence with Trump, claiming that the Iranians are rebuilding their nuclear program at new sites. Trump made some hints about this, but it gave very little detail. And of course, the Israeli intelligence has to be taken with a lot of skepticism, mindful of the political interests that they have in starting another war. But they seem to not have completely given up on the idea of using the nuclear issue as a way of restarting the war. But then, of course, they shifted a lot of their focus towards the missiles. And Based on the press conference, it seems like Trump accepted a lot of these talking points. Whether that actually is the decision or not remains to be seen. But there are Israelis who also believe, who I've spoken to, who believe that even without a green light or approval of the United States, involvement of the United States, Netanyahu may nevertheless start the war on his own, Israel alone, even though this will be a militarily very dangerous move to do. But he will do so with the calculation that once the war has started, he will be in a better position to pressure Trump to come in and support Israel, particularly if there is a high casualty event on the Israeli side, meaning that Iran retaliates very ferociously, a lot of Israelis get killed, and then Trump will use that as a second October 7th in order to really pressure the United States to support it. Either way, it looks to me extremely likely that Israel will start a war. My own prediction early on from April when I first wrote about this was that the main window for him to do so would be between September and end of December, which means right now. That timeline may have been expanded a little bit, but I do think that whether he succeeds or not, Netanyahu is going to do everything he can before he leaves office to start war with Iran again.
پس شما معتقدید در واقع جنگی که اتفاق افتاد و واکنشی که ایران نشون داد باعث شد که یک بازدارندگی دو طرفه ایجاد بشه و با توجه به اینکه نتانیاهو نمیخواد در واقع نخست وزیری رو در حالی ترک بکنه که این میراث ازش باقی بمونه، دنبال جنگ مجدد و دنبال امنیتی سازی بیشتر ایرانه که آمریکا هم وارد جنگ بعدی بکنه به صورت جدی‌تر. درسته؟
Absolutely.
و به نظر شما
and I think it's important to understand that this is not unique to Israel's approach towards Iran. Most countries have, or actually the vast majority of countries have, a defensive doctrine, a definition of threats that is essentially capability and intent. In the Israeli case, they very explicitly say that they do not look at intent. They assume that intent is always present, that all countries in the region, if they could, would destroy Israel. Their intent is always hostile. So all they look at instead is only the capabilities. And as long as Iran or Syria or any other country has the capability to be able to deter Israel, to be able to threaten Israel, to be able to infringe on Israel's domination, they will target that country. Look at what happened as soon as Turkey essentially won in Syria. And al-Shara took over that country and Bashar al-Assad fell. Immediately, the Israelis started bombing every military depot in Syria, making sure that whatever would come after Assad would be unimportant to them, but would be important to them that the country would be completely defenseless. The logic of this doctrine at the end of the day, however, is very important to understand. It means that in order for Israel to feel secure in their own minds, everyone else in the region has to feel insecure. The only way for Israel to have security is for everyone else to not have security. Because if any country has the ability to retaliate against Israel, to deter Israel, Israel views that as a threat, in essence, not to its security, but to its domination. And its doctrine for security is to have domination. Security is achieved through domination, not through balance. This is part of the reason why you had a situation back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in which Iran was not seen as a threat by the Israelis, and there was an alliance between the Shah and Israel, but that all of that has changed ever since. Yes, the Islamic Republic has adopted a very hostile view towards Israel, etc. All of those are also important factors, but at the root of it is the fact that Iran has emerged as a power that can challenge Israel, that has the capacity to do so. It did not have that during the time of the Shah. Geography was far greater back then. Iran did not have the capacity of being able to reach Israel back then. It does now. And as soon as Turkey emerged as a more powerful country as a result of the victory in Syria, the Israelis have focused extensively, including in the meeting yesterday, on Turkey, and all of the media in Israel is talking about the potential coming war between Israel and Turkey. So regardless of the policies of Iran, and I'm not saying that Iran should not have different policies or approach these issues differently, or that it would make no difference. It would make a difference. But at the core of it, however, is a security doctrine in Israel that says they have to dominate the entire region, otherwise they're not secure. And there is no version of Iran, in my view, democratic, Islamic, whatever it would be, theocratic, monarchic, that ever would accept living under Israeli domination.
سوال بعدی من در این مورد خواهد بود که با توجه به بحث جنگ که شما مطرح کردید که نتانیاهو به اون نیاز داره فرمودید، سوالم این هستش که اساساً این فرمت جنگ آتی چطور خواهد بود؟ یعنی هدف اصلی اسرائیل توی حمله بعدی چه خواهد بود؟ آیا این یه حمله گسترده خواهد بود یا یک حمله هدفمند؟
It's a very good question, and I fear that it's very difficult to answer that, because obviously a key element for the Israelis will be to try to see if they can pull off another surprise on Iran. Iran clearly was taken off guard in the June attack, taken by surprise. And I think Iran was quite surprised to see the very significant Mossad penetration of Iranian territory. And that key surprise gave the Israelis a major benefit, an advantage in the first 12 to 24 hours, but then it started to shift. The Israelis know very well that they need to pull off something like that again, and what that would be is extremely difficult to guess, of course. It is interesting that in the first war, they did not seem to focus too much on some of the border areas of Iran with ethnic minorities. That might be something they may try. They certainly will try again, one way or another, to see what they can do to decapitate the regime as a whole. And I think it's also very important to understand in this context, the Israeli objective is not regime change. Regime change means that you actually take out the existing regime and you replace it with another regime. There is no example in history in which regime change has been achieved through an air bombardment campaign. It has always required soldiers on boots on the ground, essentially land troops inside that other country. But more importantly, regime change is very complicated and costly, and it's particularly costly because the conduct of the subsequent regime ends up becoming part of the track record for the country conducting the regime change. So, for instance, in the case of Iraq, the United States did a regime change operation in Iraq, and then the performance of the Iraqi government afterwards became very much part of the track record as to whether America's war was successful or not. The Israelis don't want this. They want something that in many ways is much, much worse. They want regime collapse. They want state collapse, which is much easier to achieve. You essentially don't replace the regime with anything. You allow for a vacuum to exist, which likely will lead to some form of a civil war, which means that Iran will consume its power internally rather than being able to project power externally and by that challenge Israeli domination. This is easier to achieve, it is less costly, and Israel essentially does not take responsibility for what happens afterwards. Whereas if it actually tried to impose a new regime on Iran, it would be responsible for the performance of that regime. Here, they just wash their hands off of it. They will claim that they support the son of the former Shah and things of that nature, but that is mainly because it's easier for them to be able to conduct what they're doing right now by giving an impression that they have the well-being of the Iranian people at mind. But that is clearly not what they have. In fact, an Israeli general told me at one point, he said that Iran was once a friend of Israel during the time of the Shah, then it turned into an enemy. Even if it turns into a friend again, it can once again turn into an enemy. As a result, Israel does not care that much about what the regime in Iran is. What it cares about is the capabilities that Iran has. And I think this is very important to understand, particularly mindful of how the Israelis have been trying to fester instability in the country, and that obviously there's some elements in the diaspora who have now openly sided with Israel, thinking that this is something that will enable them to take power in Iran, thinking that the Israelis have the best interest of the Iranian people in mind. I think that is an extremely naive interpretation of history.
با توجه به صحبتایی که داشتید، به نظر شما استراتژی کلان دولت فعلی آمریکا با دولت اسرائیل مشترکه، یا اینکه مثل گذشته و سالهای پیش همچنان یک تفاوت‌ها و اختلافاتی هست در مورد ایران؟
There are clear differences, but there are also clear convergences. And more importantly, you have an administration that is very different. Let me put it this way. First of all, there's almost no path dependency, meaning what they decided last week, they can change it completely this week. They don't care. And in some aspects, this has actually served the US quite well. It was a huge mistake by Trump to restart war with Yemen and the Houthis. He realized that after about 40 days, and he ended that operation entirely. And he even praised the Houthis, saying that they're a tough bunch of cookies. The vast majority of American presidents would essentially only have continued that war, knowing very well that it was a failure, that it didn't lead to anything, but nevertheless not have the courage to stop it. So the path dependency on some terms is actually benefiting the US, but also on other terms, it's led to a situation in which it's very difficult for countries to take what Trump says seriously, because he can constantly change his mind. And that is the same thing that is happening in the US-Israel relationship. For several months, the US did whatever the Israelis wanted in Gaza in particular, including on Iran. And then there was this overreach by the Israelis when they attacked Doha. And then there was a massive change in the White House, and they started to put real pressure on the Israelis. We always knew that that pressure would not last, that eventually the pendulum would swing back and there would be more of a convergence, mainly because the Israelis pressure Trump on it, and Trump is not paying all that much attention to it because he has other things that he needs to focus on. Same thing is happening with Iran. And there you also have two very clear political factions that are supporting the administration that are completely opposed to each other. On the one hand, you have some of the main donors, particularly Miriam Adelson, who is the biggest donor to Trump, and the people around her, and people like Mark Levine and others who appeal to the older Republicans, the Republicans that are above 50 years old and who watch Fox News. They are still this more traditional Republican foreign policy view, represented by people like Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton. They want, it's in essence, a neo-imperial foreign policy approach in favor of American hegemony in the Middle East and globally. From their standpoint, they're completely aligned with Israel. They defer to Israel, and they have been pushing Trump in that direction. Then you have a different faction, a very important faction, which is actually the base of Trump, the voters in particular, and particularly those who are under 50, and within that group, those who are under 35 or so. They follow the thinking of people like Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, earlier on Charlie Kirk, and they have a very different perspective. They have by and large completely turned against Netanyahu and largely against Israel as well. They don't want to see the United States engage in all of these different wars. They want to get out of the Middle East. They believe that the Iraq War was a huge mistake. They believe that Israel was a key factor pushing the United States into that war, that Israel is a key factor pushing the United States into all kinds of wars, and that as a result, Israel is more or less an enemy of the United States. Some of them have very explicitly said it in those terms. And this is a particularly strong view held by younger white Republicans who have a remarkably different view of Israel than their parents have. At the end of the day, those voters are crucial to Trump, but so are the donors. And in this struggle between these two, you have seen how Trump has wobbled. On the one hand, earlier on being in favor of diplomacy, then shifting in favor of the Israeli position on diplomacy as a result of some of these pressures from the donors and others. How that will play out is really difficult to tell. If you go by the press conference yesterday, it clearly seemed as if Trump was siding with Netanyahu against his own base, who don't want these wars. But again, we can't judge everything based on that press conference. One thing that is important to understand is this, though. There is a political horizon. In November of next year, there will be midterm elections. Those are going to be very crucial for Trump for the simple reason that if the Democrats come back to power, both in the House and in the Senate, they will very likely pursue the impeachment of Trump once again. And it will also be very difficult for him, even short of that, to pursue his agenda. So he has to do whatever he can to win those midterm elections. It's not looking good for him. To win those midterm elections, he cannot afford to alienate his base. Just having the donors on his side is not enough. He needs to have the base and he needs to energize the base because the midterm elections will very much depend on voter turnout. Because Trump himself is not on the ticket, meaning he's not part of the elections, it will be difficult for them to get the type of voter turnout that they want. If you add on to that, economic difficulties, him starting wars left and right, he's caving to Israel, etc. All of these factors will suppress voter turnout that will be really to the detriment of Trump's own political situation. And it doesn't matter how much money Adelson pumps into these different races. Not to say that that is unimportant, but keep in mind, Kamala Harris raised far more money than Trump did, and she still lost the election. So money is not everything. Voter turnout is crucial. And the base right now is not as excited about Trump as they were before, and they will be even less excited if he starts another war. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean that that is the factor that he will care about the most at the end of the day. So it's very difficult to tell, but these are the factors that I think goes into the decision making.
در جریان جنگ گذشته، منظور من البته قبل از جنگ، خیلی از چهره‌های ارشد جریان ماگا مثل حتی چارلی کرک با ترامپ صحبت کردن که در واقع به ایران حمله نکنه، اما این حمله اتفاق افتاد در نهایت. هرچند بعضیا معتقدند که این جریان تونست وسعت جنگ رو در واقع کاهش بده و از گسترشش جلوگیری بکنه. اما الان شما معتقدید که با توجه به انتخابات میان دوره‌ای این و نیاز ترامپ به رای دهندگان ماگا، این جریان میتونه الان تاثیرگذاری بیشتری توی عدم مشارکت آمریکا حداقل در جنگ بگیره، درسته؟
درسته. But I think it's important to understand what happened in June. This is at least how the administration perceives the situation. I'm not making a judgment as to whether this is right or wrong. But they were under these two pressures. The pressure from Charlie Kirk, from Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, Candace Owens, and that base. And on the other hand, from Miriam Ailes and Mark Levine and these traditional neoconservative Republicans. In their view, the White House essentially took a middle road. Because it's important to understand, as I said earlier on, yes, the Israelis wanted the United States to enter the war. They finally got that. But it was not the type of involvement that the Israelis wanted. The Israelis wanted the United States to be fully involved in the war. Instead, what Trump did is that he only targeted the nuclear facilities, and then he called it an end, and then he pushed for a ceasefire. So from the standpoint of the White House, they believe that they essentially tried to find a middle ground between these two forces. And then pushed for an end to the war. Obviously, from an Iranian standpoint, that is still completely unacceptable because it was still an attack on Iran, etc. But I think if you look at it from their perspective, Trump could have gone much further and fully joined in the Israelis on the attack. That is what the Israelis wanted. In fact, I don't think the Israelis would have accepted a ceasefire until they fully realized that Trump was not going to join the war fully. If the US was joining the war fully, the Israelis would have accepted the cost and the pain that they endured because of the missiles, because it would have been worth it for them. The cost-benefit analysis would have been worth it for them because the US's firepower would have come in and targeted Iranian facilities. But the US chose not to do so. And as a result, it also didn't make sense for the Israelis to continue a war in which they were paying such a heavy cost. Now, the situation going forward in many ways is still very similar because you still have these two different powers, but you are closer to the elections. The election impact is much bigger on Trump's mind than it is now, and it will become bigger and bigger as time passes. This is part of the reason why in my earlier prediction I said the main window closes by the end of December, because then the more Trump gets into the election season, the harder it will become for the Israelis to convince Trump to go along with this war.
به نظر شما هنوز میشه فرمولی در واقع پیدا کرد که ایران و آمریکا بتونن به توافق برسن و بتونن جفتشون هم احساس پیروزی کنن و بیسشون هم این در واقع توافق رو بفروشن؟ میشه فرمولی پیدا کرد هنوز؟
I think there still is one. And I know that it is very difficult to make this argument right now, particularly to the Iranian audience, given what happened in the summer, given that Iran showed far greater flexibility in these negotiations than he has done in any other negotiation, that the deal in many ways would have been more attractive to the US than the JCPOA was that the Iranians were willing to offer. I think it was a very genuine effort by the Iranians for diplomacy, and the end result was that they still got attacked in the midst of negotiations. So and of course, paid a very heavy price with 1,000 people killed, more than 1,000 people killed, including, of course, nuclear scientists and their families. Nevertheless, I think it's important to understand that the current situation is not stable. There is no such thing as waiting Trump out for 3 years, thinking that nothing will happen in the next 3 years. I mean, we see right now, just yesterday, Netanyahu was here again, pushing for another war, and once again managing to get Trump to slowly but surely come to his side and take his position, at least based on the press conference. And to think that this can go on for 3 years, I personally find it extremely unlikely. But on top of that, on what basis is the calculation that the next American president will not be inclined towards war and will not be inclined towards negotiations in the manner that Trump nevertheless is? I think, frankly, the situation with Trump is that he can go all the way towards war, but he can also go all the way towards a big deal, a major deal with Iran. Whereas with Biden and with most American presidents, they would be very hesitant about war, but they would be even more hesitant about diplomacy. So you may end up going back into a situation in which you have a Biden, which is essentially nothing will happen. And then Iran will be under sanctions for another 4 years, destroying so much of its society and economy. So I still think that there is a greater opportunity, but also a greater risk with Trump. Now, how do you explore the opportunity? Here's where I think the Iranian mistake was during the previous negotiations. The psychology of Trump was largely misread. Iran tried, and I think it was a very genuine effort to show that there are business opportunities. It showed greater flexibility, signaling that it was welcoming American investments into the Iranian economy. And that makes sense because that is Trump's language in many ways. But it's not just Trump's language that needs to be spoken. It's also Trump's psychology. This is a person who comes from 50 plus years in American New York's real estate and development. It's a cutthroat industry. He has been, fighting competitors for 50 years in very, very vicious ways. But I would say that probably in none of those circumstances did he ever encounter a conflict in which the other side refused to talk to him directly. In his world, in his mind, this is a major sign of either disrespect or insincerity, because the unwillingness on the Iranian side to have a direct conversation with Trump himself. I understand why, from the Iranian perspective, there's a lot of hesitancy about this, but it's fascinating to me to see what happened in the case of Brazil, for instance. Brazil and the US was going in a very negative direction, and then at the UN, Lula and Trump run into each other. Lula, which is the president of Brazil, hugs Trump, and then Trump goes and gives his speech to the UN General Assembly. And for 5 minutes, he goes off script just praising Lula. And then Brazil got a much better deal on the tariffs. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that that is a long-lasting thing, but the issue is that you will not be able to fully explore the degree to which Trump is capable and perhaps even willing to be flexible on issues such as enrichment unless you engage with him directly, not just through Steve Witkoff or anyone else, but actually directly to him. And I think this has been a big mistake. I think the Iranian position was probably that at the end of the process, if there was a deal, perhaps there could have been a handshake, there could be something like this. That's not how Trump works. In fact, most of the other countries have done it the other way, and they've gotten much better results than Iran, which is from the outset, give him a PR win, give him a handshake, give him something that in his mind shows respect, and then use the ability for that to unlock some flexibility on his end to be able to get a deal. I base this on conversations with people in the Trump administration, including some people who recently left, who have said in very clear words that the Iranians just needed to talk to him directly, and it frankly did not even seem to matter which Iranian it was. It just needed to be someone. I think it's very important to also understand that when the Iranians don't talk to Trump directly, guess who then he ends up talking to? All he talked to were people like Mark Levin, Sheldon Adelson, Netanyahu, etc., and their supporters. That's what, essentially was 80% of the conversation he had. And the Iranians themselves were not talking directly to him, and then expecting that that would lead to them winning the argument. It wouldn't. There's no guarantee, of course, that this will work, but I don't see any chance of any other approach working. If you go back and you just have an approach of having these indirect or even direct conversations with Steve Witkoff, etc., I think then you turn the issue into just a nuclear negotiation in which Trump does not show any flexibility. And in fact, if the negotiations are just about the nuclear issue, then this will end up becoming a zero-sum game. If it's a zero-sum negotiation, Trump's instinct is to be maximalist. Go for zero, which is unacceptable to Iran. I think the other card Iran needs to play in order to unlock a diplomatic solution here is to put something on the table that only Iran can put. Iran can put business opportunities on the table, and those are attractive. But Saudi Arabia and the GCC can put far larger economic benefits. In fact, they can offer investments in the US, which is what Trump is even more interested in. The only thing Iran can offer that no other country can offer is actually the opportunity for reconciliation between the US and Iran. Something historic, something that really plays to Trump's ego, that he can say, I'm the president that ended 45 years of US-Iran enmity. When something that attractive is put in front of him, that's when I think you may see that he is willing to be reasonable and flexible on other issues, such as enrichment. Because from a nuclear standpoint, non-proliferation standpoint, there is no problem for Iran having enrichment on its own soil, particularly if it's part of a consortium that involves other regional states. There's no problem. This should be completely acceptable from a US standpoint. But if it's just a zero-sum negotiation over the nuclear, then Trump will take a maximalist position. But if you add some other element to the negotiation, an opportunity for a historic win from his perspective, that's when I think you will see him being much more flexible. Iran has not tested that card. Iran has not even tested the card of talking to him directly. And unless that is done, I think we will never know what could have been achieved. I am firmly of the belief, however, that if you go back to the same formula as before, it will not work. And it will only actually accelerate a movement towards war. Because if you start negotiations now, particularly when Trump still believes that Iran is weak and as a result has to accept zero enrichment, and you have negotiations that end up becoming zero-sum, which inevitably will cause them to fail, that then pushes Trump to a position of thinking, okay, either he needs to just walk away from this or he needs to take more military action. And I think, unfortunately, the risk is greater that he will take military action. So I would actually argue against diplomacy, which is not the usual position I take, if it is done in the manner that it has been done so far. I'm very convinced that it will fail. It has to be completely rethought in order for it to have a chance.
پس شما معتقدید کلید حل بحران دیدار آقای پزشکیان با ترامپ هستش و گذاشتن گزینه احیای روابط با آمریکا، و اگر ما بخوایم در واقع ایران بخواد مذاکره‌ای به سبک گذشته انجام بده، اون مذاکره عملا مسیر رو برای جنگ هموار میکنه. درسته؟
Yes, no, this latter part, yes. But the earlier part, let me just add some details. It does not have to be Dr. Pezeshkian, nor does it have to be necessarily a physical meeting. There needs to be a conversation. It could be a phone call. It could be Dr. Pezeshkian. It could be someone else. But bottom line, there needs to be a direct channel to Trump himself. He has even said this himself on numerous occasions. I understand that politically, this will be costly in Iran, but I think we have to recognize that we've come into a new situation. I think we're at the end of the road. I think for a very long time, Iran has tried to end its hostilities with the United States without actual reconciliation. And I don't think that is possible any longer. I think we've reached a point in which if you want to end the hostilities, there has to actually be also a positive reconciliation. And this, I know, politically is very difficult for Tehran right now to consider. But I frankly don't think there is any other path. I also think it's very important to understand that this does not necessarily mean full normalization or many of these different things. At the end of the day, it's about allowing Trump to say that he is the president that ended 45 years of enmity. What that in practice means can be different things, and it can be worked out. But I think something of that kind needs to be given. Look at what happened when Trump did a 180 on Gaza. On the one hand, it was because of Israel's overreach, of course. It was also because the anger against Israel in his own base was really bubbling up to a very dangerous level. But it was also because these Arab countries and Turkey came together, put together a plan and put it in front of him jointly and enabled him to say, you're the peacemaker. And he goes on at every press conference and says that he has ended 3,000 years of war in the region. And for the first time, there's peace in the region. No one believes it, but they allow him to say it because it's important for him to be able to say it. And it was important for him to be able to say it in order for him to be able to shift his position. I'm not saying that shift is sufficient. I'm not saying it's necessarily working. I think it could have worked better. But nevertheless, this is part of the psychology that has to be part of any negotiation strategy. Iran oftentimes has been complaining that the United States doesn't understand Iran's psychology, that it's so important for Iran to feel that it is respected and that he wants every agreement and diplomacy to be based on mutual respect, and that is even more important than the substance of the negotiations. Well, Trump also has a psychology, and for Iran to be successful, it needs to understand and work with that psychology.
در واقع اونطور که من متوجه شدم، اگر ایران ارتباط مستقیم با تیم ترامپ و خودش بگیره، در مذاکرات میتونه حتی مواضع تعدیل شده از آمریکا ببینه در حوزه‌های مختلف مثل غنیسازی و غیره. درسته؟
My impression is that there is ability and capacity for flexibility on that issue, but not if it ends up becoming a zero-sum negotiation. Zero-sum negotiation will push him into a maximalist position. If in the American expression here is to say, if you expand the pie, and by the way, when I say expand the pie, I'm not talking about additional security issues. I'm not talking about regional issues. I'm not talking about missiles. I'm not saying that Iran should negotiate over the missiles at all. I'm talking about expanding the issue outside of the security realm onto something that is of value of Trump. something that, again, plays to his psychology, enables him to say he's a peacemaker, enables him to say that he did something historic. That is where I think you can unlock flexibility, reasonableness on this issue. And I think in Trump's own mind, this is what he had in mind when he, throughout the election season last year, kept on saying that his only problem with Iran is the nuclear. As long as there's no nuclear weapon, he wants to have peace, etc., etc., etc. Now, I think it's important to understand that there's no guarantee that this is working. I'm not saying that this is, a remarkable fix and everything will be great or anything like that. In fact, almost every deal that you see Trump strike is not leading to a perfect situation in any way, shape, or form. But in the case of U.S. and Iran, we're looking at an absolute catastrophe heading our way. And the question is, what type of a move can avert this catastrophe? And I think these limited, small moves are not going to be able to do it. There has to be something much bigger, something historic, something that he can say is historic.
به نظر شما اساساً بحث موشکی جزو خواسته های آمریکا هست یا نه؟ چون من اخیراً دیدم نماینده آمریکا در شورای امنیت هم فقط بحث غنیسازی صفر رو مطرح کرد. اساساً موشکی جزو خواسته های آمریکا برای توافق هست یا نه به نظر شما؟
At least up until yesterday, it wasn't. Whether that has changed as a result of Trump's visit with Netanyahu or Netanyahu's visit with Trump, we don't know. The press conference seemed to suggest that at least Netanyahu was making progress on this issue. And this, again, in my view, is the danger of thinking that time is on the side of peace. It is not. For Iran to think that it can just wait out another 3 years. It will just give Netanyahu more and more opportunities to constantly move Trump in his direction. Again, we don't know exactly if there has been a shift, but at least rhetorically, it seems like it's moved in Netanyahu's direction. The other thing I think is also important to understand, as part of Trump's capability or characteristic that is so different from other presidents, is also his way of undoing things that other presidents wouldn't even dare to touch. One of my main criticism of the JCPOA, and as you know, I've been a huge supporter of the JCPOA, but one of my main criticism of the JCPOA was that primary sanctions were never lifted, meaning that the only sanctions that were lifted were the sanctions in which the US prevented European and Asian companies to go into Iran, but it never allowed American companies to go in, which is the primary sanctions. I was of the belief, and I wrote it in my book immediately after the JCPOA, that if you had primary sanctions lifted, then that would enable American companies to come in and would have made the JCPOA much more durable. It would be making it much more difficult for Trump to undo the deal as he did in 2018. But part of the reason why primary sanctions were not on the table was because Obama didn't feel that he had the strength of being able to go to Congress and present a deal that even lifted primary sanctions. And for a very long time, that was the conventional wisdom, that no one actually can lift these sanctions, that these sanctions are unliftable. Look at what Obama did on Cuba. He had an opening with Cuba, but he only lifted the executive orders. He never even tried to touch the congressional sanctions. Now look what Trump did on Syria. Just last week, they fully lifted all of the congressional sanctions on Syria. I personally never thought that was possible. He pushed that through. Now, we can have question marks as to whether his opening to Shara is a good one or not. Let's set that aside. I'm just talking about the technical issue of actually lifting sanctions, which is the key thing the Iranians want. Trump did that 100 times more on Syria than Obama did on Iran in the JCPOA. He has that capability. However, will he have that capability after November of 2026 if Democrats take over the House and the Senate? So the ability for Trump to actually deliver on a deal with Iran in substantive terms with actual sanctions relief. And I think that Trump is actually anti-sanctions. He's very pro-tariffs, but very anti-sanctions. So he's happy to lift sanctions if he could get something for it. But that ability may not exist after November. In fact, it will probably wane. Trump is weaker today than he was in June of this past year. And that weakness is probably going to continue to grow. So from the standpoint of actually making a deal, I just don't see any factor that works in favor of a deal and works in favor of the US and Iran for a deal as time passes.
پس فرصت عملاً برای ایران خیلی کوتاهه. یعنی اگه ایران بخواد توافقی هم دست پیدا بکنه تا انتخابات میان دوره‌ای، فرصت بسیار خوبیه که با ترامپ به توافق برسه، چون همونطور که فرمودید ترامپ معامله پذیرتر به نظر میرسه و قدرت لغو کلیه تحریم ها رو داره، همونطور که برخلاف در واقع بسیاری از مخالفت هایی که شد تحریم های سوریه هم کاملا برداشت.
I would just slightly word it differently in the sense that I would say that the opportunity for the deal is diminishing. I'm not saying it's a great opportunity. I'm just saying the opportunity for a deal is diminishing and the risk for a confrontation is dramatically increasing. Now, the Iranian approach appears to me to be not to engage in a new round of negotiations until there is clarity from the US side that enrichment will be accepted. Meaning that they're not going to walk into another negotiation and then see that all Trump wants is zero enrichment and as a result go. And I understand that. This is the strategy to actually work with the JCPOA. And also based on what I said earlier on, if you start negotiation and the position truly is zero enrichment, you're actually accelerating things towards war. So I understand that. But I think this is where you have to leapfrog. You have to just change the dynamics. It's not about starting negotiations. It's about starting a conversation. You need to have a conversation with Trump and just establish that channel. Establish a common vision of what you want to see that is much bigger than just a nuclear issue. And then get a hint from Trump of the flexibility that he may have and then start the negotiation. There's going to be some risk taking. It's not going to be as clear as it was with the JCPOA, in which it wasn't until in secret talks in Oman, in which the US accepted enrichment, that the official negotiations really started. It's not going to be as clear as that. But it has to be something in which the conversation begins, and the conversation is bigger than just a nuclear issue, and it is direct, and from there on, you go into real negotiations. But to just sit and wait, and I'm not saying that there's all passivity, that Iran isn't doing anything, but thinking that out of the blue, Trump will accept enrichment again, and then negotiation starts. I just don't think that will work.
یکی از نگرانی‌های در واقع ایران این بوده که به رفتار مذاکراتی آمریکا چندان اعتماد نداشته، کما اینکه اینها معتقدند و گفته میشه که مثلا آقای ویتکاف با غنیسازی 3.5% در نقطه از مذاکرات موافقت کرده بود، بعد از اینکه با واکنش منفی مواجه میشه ظاهرا از اون عقب نشینی میکنه.
Yeah. First of all, that is absolutely correct. I mean, you had a situation in which in the talks and in public, enrichment was accepted by the United States. Trump never used the word enrichment in his public comments during the campaign and even during up until May or so in the negotiations. And I can definitely understand the tremendous disappointment on the Iranian side because, and this incidentally is not unique to Iran. In the negotiations on Venezuela, in the negotiations on Ukraine, whether you talk to the Ukrainians, you talk to the Europeans, or you talk to the Russians, all of them have the same complaint, that the Trump administration keeps on changing its position. This is just a reality. It is a very difficult reality, it's a very problematic reality, but it is a reality. Expecting that to completely change before negotiations begin is going to lead to no negotiations, and no negotiations is going to lead to war. So all it is about trying to do something to minimize this. And again, had the Iranians talked directly with Trump in the previous negotiations, I think the effort by the Israelis to push Trump's negotiation position away from no nuclear weapons to no enrichment would likely not have succeeded. But they succeeded in this historical case for a variety of reasons, and one of them was that Trump never heard from the Iranians. They never spoke to him directly. Am I saying that this is a guarantee? No. But I'm saying I personally don't believe they would have succeeded. I think it would have been much, much more difficult for them to succeed. If there had been that direct channel, if there had been an effort to be able to work with his psychology, Iran had already thrown out things that were actually useful, such as opening up the economy, etc., but it was not sufficient. And in the future negotiation, again, I think it's a necessity to have those negotiations because otherwise there definitely will be a shift towards war. I think the most effective way of trying to counter the Israeli effort to sabotage the talks is to talk directly to Trump, to expand the pie. It is not just nuclear, it's about something bigger, something more historic, something that is so valuable to Trump that he's willing to say no to the Israelis. Enrichment is not. I mean, frankly, anyone who thinks that Trump even understands what centrifuges do, etc., is over-interpreting the situation. He is, as they say over here, he is really hostile to details, but he's very, very open to big picture thing. And Iran failed to present a big picture attraction to him.
برخی در ایران در واقع معتقدند که در واشنگتن ایران در واقع به ایران به عنوان یک کشوری که به شدت الان بازیگر ضعیفی شده بعد از جنگ بهش نگاه میکنن و الان اگه ما بریم مذاکره بکنیم باید در واقع همه چیز رو بدیم و هیچ نگیریم. این تصور تو آمریکا الان در مورد ایران همینطوری هستش و اگر این تصور در مورد ایران وجود داره تهران چطوری میتونه معادله رو تغییر بده؟
I think absolutely this is a perception that exists not just in Washington, but certainly in the White House and in Trump's own mind. I think they do view Iran as much weaker than before. And as a result, again, if this ends up becoming a zero-sum negotiation, given the perception he has about Iranian weakness, rightly or wrongly, he will automatically go towards a maximalist position because in his mind, he's won, Iran lost, so why on earth would he compromise? And again, this is the reason why the pie needs to be expanded. The entire conversation needs to be expanded. Because if Iran entered these negotiations on a nuclear file alone, I mean, just take a look at the fundamentals. Trump has essentially achieved zero enrichment while giving zero sanctions relief. Why wouldn't he think that he's in a stronger position? And why would he compromise if this is the only variable of the negotiation? Now, of course, Iran still has some nuclear leverage, etc., etc., but it is nowhere where it was prior to what it was in June. So again, if the negotiations are entered only on this variable, it will be zero-sum. Trump will view Iran as very weak, and as a result, he will take a maximalist position. It will fail, and we will be back to war. The only way out of it is to actually think about this entirely differently. This is not about a nuclear deal. This is about a US-Iran deal. It's about changing that relationship from what it has been in the last 45 years to something more positive. The details as to whether there's normalization, etc., can be set aside, I think, at this moment. But something different, something that is a major win for him, and frankly, is not a loss for Iran. Because in what ways is it a win for Iran to continue the current situation? And I also would say this. There's no other president, in my view, that would have this perspective. There's no other president in the United States that has been or will come, at least as I can foresee, that would be attracted to the idea of reconciliation with Iran. For everyone else, that is an unattractive deal because it only carries a bunch of political costs. The pro-Israel movement will be so unhappy. Israel will be unhappy. Some regional states will be unhappy. The only president that actually sees it not only as attractive but desirable is Trump.
اخیراً سند امنیت ملی دولت امریکا منتشر شد. من می‌خواستم از خدمتتون در این رابطه هم بپرسم که جایگاه ایران و اسرائیل در این سند چیه و اینکه به نظر میرسه اونطور که من خوندم آمریکا میخواد در واقع تنظیم کننده موازنه در خاورمیانه بشه و اسرائیل رو تو این راستا نقش بیشتری بهش بده. این برداشت درستیه یا
I don't know if I see it that way. I see that the NSS in many ways contain fresh thinking that has never been expressed in an American national security strategy document. It completely rejected global American hegemony. This is the first time we see that since 1945. Again, the NSS has not existed since then, but the point is, it's the first time that we see this. So it was very much a repudiation, a rejection of past American grand strategy. But then when it comes to what it replaces it with, it is contradictory and it's not clear. It's convoluted exactly what it replaces it with. It does say that the Middle East is no longer that important to the United States. It recedes in importance, it says. But on the other hand, it doubles down, or at least repeats, language that is exactly the language that brought the United States into the region militarily over the course of the last couple of decades, such as saying that Iran is the main source of instability in the region. These are the kind of building blocks of the previous policy. So it rejected the previous policy, it kept some of its language, and it again keeps on saying that the region is now experiencing peace, etc., which I don't think anyone believes in. So it is contradictory, and I don't think it's a clear step in any particular direction, except for the fact that it at least says that it wanted to reject the previous policy. But I think there's things in it that are potentially useful. The fact that the region is of lesser importance ultimately should mean that the United States also should spend far less resources militarily in that region. The question is, how do you enable that to happen? Again, a bigger deal between the US and Iran that reconciles the US and Iran is exactly what is needed in order to make it easier for the United States to leave the region militarily. This is the key reason why the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Israelis were also against the JCPOA, because they saw it as the beginning of an effort for the United States to be able to pivot to Asia. In fact, in some instances, Obama came very close to explicitly state that. So I think there's opportunities in it. Had the NSS been exactly the same as it always been and what it was under Biden, etc., it would have been a firm continuation of the old policy, which is the United States has to be a military dominant power in the region. Security of Israel is the most important thing in the region, etc. This was not a complete walk away from it, but it was in some ways starting to undo some of those elements.
به عنوان سوال آخر میخواستم از خدمتون در مورد در واقع همین بحث منازعه ایران بپرسم که این درگیری با ایران رو میشه در چارچوب رقابت آمریکا و چین دید یا نه، و اگر اینطوری ببینیم به نظر شما چین اگر جنگی در بگیره یا اتفاقات دیگه‌ای که بخواد جدی بشه، چین به نظر شما ورود جدی‌تر میکنه در قالب ارائه تجهیزات نظامی به تهران یا نه؟
I think the Chinese are going to be very, very careful. They do not want to see Iran collapse. They do not want to see the instability. They do not want to see a new government in Iran that would be extremely pro-American, although I don't think that they think that that is very likely to happen. But they also are not going to allow themselves to get too far dragged into something in the region. If the United States commits another major mistake and goes to another war and destabilizes the region, it will be bad for China, but it will be even worse for the United States. Moreover, you have now in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, countries that, despite the fact that they're very close to the United States, are also closer to China than they were before, which means that the United States, that China has options in the region in ways that perhaps 10 years ago it did not foresee that it would be able to have, because you didn't have the same willingness on Saudi, on UAE side to kind of pivot away from the United States and put pressure on the US by expanding its relations with China. And as a result, Iran's importance, I don't think, is as significant to China than what it otherwise could have been. Iran is very much alone. The Russians have made it very clear in conversations I've had with them that even when it comes to things such as Venezuela, which is much closer to getting attacked by the United States, and that would be a blow to Russia's interest, they're not going to do anything because what's most important for them is to end the war in Ukraine and make a deal with the US. And as a result, they're not going to do anything to upset Trump that could diminish their much more higher priority, which is getting that deal with the US themselves. So for Iran to essentially think that it can count on many of those different states, not in the sense that it will not get some help, clearly it will, but that it can count on it for its security, I think would be a huge mistake. The idea that there is some sort of an Eastern option for Iran, I think the best option for Iran is the same option as it is for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and which is that it's not that they're rejecting one of the other, they're positively embracing both and then playing the role as a middle power of playing the great powers against each other rather than having such a hostile relationship with one of them that then makes them dependent on the other superpower, even though that superpower is not dependent on Iran.
آقای پارسی خیلی ممنون از لطفی که کردید و دعوت ما رو پذیرفتید. خیلی آگاهی بخش بود تحلیلتون. نکته پایانی دارید؟
Thank you so much for the time. Really, really appreciate it. And again, my apologies for doing this in English, but I think it will actually be to the benefit of the viewers because I will be able to express myself much more clearly.
خیلی ممنون. لطف کردید.
قربان شما. خیلی خوشحال شدم. خدا نگهدار.
خیلی ممنون.